Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear esteemed listeners. Wherever you may be hearing me from, I welcome you to the first episode of Ahaki's podcast. Today, I am your host, and my name is Olga Jessica. I am a PhD fellow at Afia Nahaki, also known as Ahaki. So, for those who may be wondering what Afia Nahaki is, Afia Nahaki is an African research and training institution that advances health, human rights, and sexual and reproductive health and rights using the Afrocentric approach. And with me in the studio is the esteemed Professor Seggane Musisi, who is a professor of psychiatry and former chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Makerere University College of Health Sciences. He's also a senior consultant psychiatrist at Mulago National Referral and Teaching Hospital and the Ugandan Ministry of Health. In addition, Professor Seggane is a fellow at the Uganda National Academy of Sciences, and he's the chief executive officer of Entebbe Lakeside Hospital. Today, we will be speaking on the topic Decolonizing the Legacy of Colonial Medicine in Uganda. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. We're really, really grateful. We appreciate you taking our time to join us today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Professor. So I think that we can just jump right to it. So I think that before we speak about decolonizing the legacy of colonial medicine in Uganda, which is our topic for today, it's important for us to speak about what it was before colonialism. In this instance, from an African lens, or better still, from the perspective of Afrocentrism. So that brings me to my question, Professor, what is Afrocentrism?
Thank you. Afrocentrism took its root in efforts to bring in African agency to issues pertaining to Africa. To a large extent, whatever has been written about Africa has been written by outsiders, Europeans mostly, writing about Africa and seeing Africans as objectives. When Africans were educated in the colonial system, they also did not examine themselves, but instead kept on again repeating that same message of others writing about us as if we ourselves had no ideas. So Afrocentrism is taking the Africa at the center of the discussion, talking about the African experience, giving the African agency to speak about their lived experiences and how they view the world as Africans. And in so doing, trying to see how African problems from African perspective have arisen and how they can be solved using African solutions by engaging Africans.
Thank you so much, Professor. So I would like to ask, using or utilizing Africans to basically tell their own stories from their lived experience. Does Afrocentrism therefore mean, or does it advocate for the superiority of African culture or African literature over other approaches?
That's a usual misconception.
Yeah.
Afrocentrism just puts the agency to the African to tell their own story, the way they see it, the way they have experienced it. It does not make itself superior, does not romanticize the past. It just says, this is the story of Africa, written by Africans, the way they lived through that experience.
Okay.
There are other isms elsewhere. There's Eurocentrism, Chinese isms, those are okay. They are there. But when it comes to Africa, let's write about ourselves. Let's talk about ourselves as Africans. Let's be the subjects, not objectives to be studied.
Yeah, thank you so much. So in essence, Afrocentrism does not advocate for the superiority of African views over other approaches. It's saying, I think for me, I would say it's inclusive. It advocates for inclusivity. So let's say that we have to include Afrocentrism into the way we see things, the way we approach things, the way we write about things, there has to be elements of Afrocentrism. That is basically Africans telling their own story by themselves.
Yes, to tell their experience, yes.
Thank you so much, Prof. Yes. So that brings me to the question. Now that we have spoken about Afrocentrism, I think that before we get to decoloniality, it's important that we talk about colonialism. There's been several information that seems to posit that Africans did not reject colonialism, but in fact, they embraced it. Professor, would this assertion be true?
It's not true at all. Africans resisted colonialism. Africans fought colonialists. Africans have continued to fight colonialism and all its legacies, and will continue to do so. We also have to remember that before that, there was another thing in Africa. There was slavery. For almost 400 years, Africans were treated as not as humans, but as animals to be hunted, tied down, traded like commodities, reared, and used for labor of others, not for themselves. And this went on for 400 years, a time when Africans were dehumanized, thought of as being less human, and not included in, quote, the human race. This changed over time, but then it was replaced by colonialism, which itself sought to take over the continent of Africa and, quote, civilize it, so-called white man's burden. In other words, bringing this education, which was really evangelization. So Africa then became a continent for commercialization, conversion, and so-called civilization. These things were wrong and eroded the essence of the African as an agent of themselves. And this is what has to change. Africa was there way before colonialists came in. Africa had always interacted with humanity. Africans had traveled the whole world over. Africans had gone to Australia. There are black people there. All those islands, Papua New Guinea. There's evidence that Africans had gone to North America and South America way before Columbus went there. Africans had been in Europe. Africans had been interacting with all of humanity from time immemorial. Not to mention that the origin of man is in Africa. Or Homo sapiens.
Africans were never subhumans.
No.
Africans existed even way before colonialism.
Exactly. As equal partners. And in fact, there's evidence that many of the things that drive today's civilization were invented in Africa.
Wow.
For example, the wheel or the hoe for agriculture. These, or writing itself. So this dispossessing of the African of their own experience, of their own being, is something that has been the subject in the last few centuries, propagated by Eurocentric writers.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor. So what then is this concept of decoloniality, and how important is it to put decolonialism at the center of our learning in Africa?
Actually, to me, I would even go beyond decolonization and say it's a whole concept to change the whole view of the contribution of Africans to humanity. Colonialism, you can trace it back to 1884 in the Berlin Conference, when they decided to divide up the African continent as a piece of cake, with each European power to take part, whatever it wanted, for its own interests. Did not even consult any African, about this. And since then, the idea of debasing everything African and rejecting it as if it did not exist started. And hence, those three C's, commerce to take of African resources, which continues up to today, conversion or evangelization, mainly into Christianity, but also other influences came in, Arab Islam and stuff like that. And then educating. which was really, European education. And with this colonialism, came this what I call the triad, that for an African to be, quote, modern, the converting or the colonizing triad consisted of a hospital, a school, and a church.
Yeah.
And they went together like that. You just have to look all over Africa to see these three being used in the mission, which the missionaries used because it was their mission to convert the African to a European.
Wow.
And this process continues on up to today.
Now it makes sense why many times when you see this mission institute, you see a church, you see a school, and then you must see a church, a school, and a hospital.
And a hospital.
Yeah.
So medicine then becomes used in the colonial mission.
Yeah.
In the mission to change the African.
Yeah.
Fully knowing that medicine is just for healing.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with those things, but it was used in this effort.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, Professor, before talking about medicine, basically healthcare. So, before colonialism, how was access to healthcare in pre-colonial Africa? Is there a significant difference from what it was like before and what it is now?
Very good question. Of course, Africans were there way before Europeans came here. Africans had diseases way before Europeans came here. Africans treated their diseases way before colonists came here.
Yeah.
So Africans had a way of looking after themselves health-wise. This changed. Three important things here. One is that in the old ways, there was nobody who did not have access to health care. The medicines were there, be them herbs, be them minerals, whatever method that they used, depending on their understanding of disease causation at that time.
Yeah.
We call that explanatory model of disease, not necessarily the biological one. And this practice was scientific because whether they used herbs, they knew some herbs that were poisonous or some minerals that were poisonous. They did not take them. They were able to recognize which herbs were able to treat certain diseases.
Yeah.
And that is science. Science is the application of knowledge through research and observation. So they had researched and then inculcated and included this in their cultural teachings. And they did not decentralize medical care. It was there for everybody. And nobody had special knowledge and therefore superiority and would use up resources, exploit the common person and say, go to Europe to get treatment. No, it was medicine for everyone with knowledge to be shared and to be used in treating disease. Yes, not the present day exclusivity.
Exclusivity as in only those who can afford healthcare would have access to healthcare. So in pre-colonial Africa, whether you could afford it or not, there was treatment. Everyone had access to healthcare.
Nobody was left to die because they could not afford healthcare. That concept did not exist in the true Ubuntu philosophy, Afrocentrically.
Thank you so much. I also think you mentioned something about scientific. Even then, African medicines were scientific, like you said. They had research. I think in Nigeria, we still have that up to now. You see people who actually have serious health issues. Let's say, for example, you meet someone who's running temperature, serious temperature, and you're like, oh, we need to get to the hospital. I think even especially during COVID, you see that people now had like plans. For example, in my mother's house, we have a particular plant whereby when everywhere was closed and people were not even getting, people were unable to gain access to medical facility. We had these plants that my mom would go squeeze together, boil, and then pour, and then give you. Even before COVID-19, you see these people, they call them alagbo, people who are herb sellers. They know what to give you for whatever illness you had. They had the cure.
Yes.
They know what proportion, how many you ought to take and whatnot. So that in itself, Prof, was scientific.
Yes. And different diseases were treated with different herbs or different minerals or different preparations. And there could be elixirs or mixtures of drugs. So people had taken time to study them over the years and had put them in their own cultural practices. And this is scientific, They had even gone to as far as doing operations here on this continent. And these things were all observed by Europeans. I think the earliest European, for example, for East Africa here was Felkin, who came. He was a medical student, and he came to study. I think he followed Livingstone, David Livingstone, and came and observed how people were treating diseases here. And he recorded. He saw people taking herbs, he saw minerals, he saw tablets, call them mumbwa, if you want to put it that way. He saw baths, call it a chogero. He saw bone setters, he saw birth attendants, and he saw doctors, native doctors there, Africans, operating people, and for example, for cesarean sections, and taking out babies. And these practices were here on the same standard as maybe Europeans at that time.
So medicine was medicine.
Medicine was medicine
No
for
superior
healing.
medicine.
No superior medicine, accessible, and not confused with anything else.
Wow. Thank you so much, Prof, for that insight. So many people have argued that colonial medical practices were used for universal humanitarian purposes. Would you consider this a myth?
No, that's a myth. Colonial medicine was part of the colonizing mission. The missionaries came here and used their medicine as a way to convert people, as a way to convince them that theirs was superior. And as part of the colonizing mission, the first thing they did was to actually ban many African medical practices. They did not license or certify any African medical practitioners. Instead, they called it primitive and banned most of it. And then so as to impose theirs. Interestingly also is that when they came, they actually would go to where power centers were. So they went to the chiefs' houses to convert them, to give them their medicines, and then eventually take over whatever ethnic group that there was to take and colonize it. So it was not necessarily for humanitarian or humanistic approaches. No, it was part of the colonizing mission. I call it the colonizing triad, which you consider of a hospital, a church, and a school. They went together, 3 in 1, to entrench colonialism and to change the African into a European.
Professor, you mentioned something about how everything African was considered to be primitive and then therefore deserving to be banned. I remembered, in fact, during COVID-19 pandemic, where parliamentarians had initiated a debate to ban Ugandan herbal preparation, even when at that time the world was resorting to herbal medicine. Can you explain why this was so?
Yes.
And I think my main question would be that can Africa continue to lose traditional medical knowledge based off on the fact that it is still considered primitive?
Yeah, maybe we should begin with that very last bit.
Okay.
Many modern medicines are themselves herbs, or started as herbs. Even such common drugs as aspirin or some ergotamine preparations for contracting the uterus after birth. These were herbs. Or curare, muscle relaxant, which is used in anesthesia, and many other medications. So, African herbs are just as potent and effective as herbs from elsewhere. It cannot be true that African herbs do not work or will not work, and herbs from other continents are the only ones which work. That's not scientific. African herbs can work, and they have been studied over centuries and used over time. Now, the idea that politicians of today will actually debate African research preparations from herbs or whatever medical practices and ban them is the result of the colonial education which they had, which told them not to accept African medical practices and call them satanic and ban them. And they're just carrying on what their colonial masters taught them. And these are the legacies that we have to change. Yes, African medicines, like all other medicines everywhere, can be researched, prepared, and can be effective. Like many other herbs, have been incorporated into modern practice,
Yeah.
including drugs like anti-malarials, for example, antimethicillin,
Yeah.
which is, I think, a common drug now being used in Uganda. It was a Chinese herb. Why can't we also synthesize the active ingredient in mululuza, for example, to treat malaria?
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think that this cannot be separated from the fact that the establishment of this missionary healthcare opened up some sort of monopoly of the medical profession, thereby leaving out African traditional healers. Do you think that decolonialism, for example, can play a role in reversing this monopolism?
True. First, missionary healthcare centralized medical care. They built big hospitals in what came later to be urban centers. We continue that practice, leaving rural areas where the majority of the people are without adequate medical care. Two, it favored the powerful, the rich, who could afford these expensive medications. And if they can't afford these treatments in these urban centers, in the so-called super hospitals, they go abroad. This was never done in the past. You had medical treatment from your community like anybody else. It was universal, it was accessible. So these are the things that we have to rethink on how to change. Building mega super hospitals and leaving common diseases like malaria untreated kills more people in the African continent than, for example, building specific, operating centers for heart disease, which kill only a small fraction of the population.
True.
So this way of changing the way we think about medicine has to change. Traditional birth attendants were there, helping women to deliver children elsewhere, anywhere. And even when they failed, especially in this part of Africa, there were traditional ways of operating them. I think Felkin talked about the cesarean sections. That is so being done way back before colonial medicine came in this country.
Wow.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Prof. So basically, before colonialism, Africans produced the medicines on their own, and the knowledge of producing these medicines were passed on from generation to generation. Prof, lately there have been fears that knowledge of the ones or the very potent traditional herbs may be lost to future generations, thereby, because, sorry, I have to come.
Yes.
We'll edit that part. So basically, Prof, before colonialism, Africans produced their own medicines, and the knowledge of producing these medicines were passed on from generations to generations. So lately, there have been fears that knowledge of the potent traditional herbs may be lost to future generations. My question would be that, is there anything that can be done to salvage that?
Thank you very much. In fact, it must be done, because knowledge gets lost over generations, if not passed on, if not written down. We have to research our traditional herbs. We have to know what's in those plants. We have to know the active medical or chemical ingredients in them. We have to write them down. We have to synthesize their formulae so as to prepare medications for our population. That knowledge in the past was universal, was accepted, was on every village, everybody knew it. And some people specialized more into it in the sense that they would know more, than others. But there was no monopoly to hide it, to certify people, license them to practice. Licensing came later. We call it the bourgeoisification of knowledge. In other words, you leave a small bourgeois of people only to be the ones who have the special knowledge and have monopoly of it, and then commercialize it, and then make profits out of it. That's not Ubuntu. That's not Afrocentrism. Medicine was there for everybody to use, to have, to access, and nobody was left to die because they could not access care. Of course, there were limitations, because even in modern medicine, people still die. And even then, of course, people still die. But not because they could not access care. It is because the medicine at that time, that was all that it could do.
And they had tried everything humanly possible to save that person.
And to also go back to another thing, that medical practice is not only just chemicals.
Yeah.
The other things, there are massages, there is counseling, there is, to use modern terms, exercise or physiotherapy.
Yeah.
All of these things were practiced in the past. There were bone setters, birth attendants. All of these things were there, and they were practicing them, and people were getting on through generations with their health care, accessing it from the common person to the chief, to everybody.
Yeah. Everyone
Yes.
had access to help.
Yes.
Speaking about, as a professor of psychiatry, speaking about conflict and post-conflict situations, we've seen that Africa, not not anywhere else, has the highest number of conflicts.
Yes.
If I'm not wrong.
Yes.
As a professor of psychiatry, I would like to ask: does the fact that there is no comprehensive mental health policy for conflict situation have anything to do with coloniality? And is there anything that decolonialism can do about this?
Yes. It's very unfortunate that Africa is caught up in so many conflicts. Africa has taken on this notion that problems have been solved by guns.
Yeah.
Guns do not solve problems. Guns have brought poverty on the continent. They have brought epidemics on the continent. They have caused flight, or capital flight also. The most educated run away. You just have to go abroad to any of these cities, New York, London, Toronto, and you find how many African doctors trained at a very, 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 very high cost, how they go into these countries. In fact, we have become the producers of doctors for those countries, leaving our people to suffer.
Yeah.
These are things that have to change.
Yeah.
The idea that we actually go to sell our own minerals, to buy guns, to come and torture our own people, and have fights every day to bring misery to our continent is a very sad reality, which must change.
Yeah.
Yes, this idea of using guns to solve problems is what they used to enslave, and then it's what they used to colonize and to change the minds of our people. We cannot allow this to continue. I think we should go back on the table to discuss how best to govern ourselves. Guns or conflicts bring disease. They have brought massive mental health problems on the continent. They have perpetuated epidemics, and they have caused a lot of poverty and misery.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thinking about all these things that you said, I'm left with the question that I feel may be on the minds of so many people. So what legacies did the colonial masters then leave for us? Why does it feel like we take one step forward and then two steps backward?
I think the best answer to that was that they brought in an education to dehumanize the African. They brought in an education which told the African that they did not know anything. They did not have a history. They did not have a civilization before the coming of the Europeans. And these things have left legacies that go on and shape the thinking of Africans today. When it comes to healthcare, we see it very much today. For example, people prefer to buy medicines from Europe, not those manufactured at home. They prefer to publish in journals which are in Europe or elsewhere, not in their own. They prefer to go to healthcare abroad, not on their own. And when they don't bring European-like standards here, they feel they have not created, things that are good enough. So we have to go back to the drawing board and say, hey, we must change things fundamentally so that Africans begin to do research in Africa, to get solutions which are African to the African problems by engaging us Africans. This is very important as a way forward. Yes.
And we Africans are so intellectual, where we are, for lack of a better word, I don't even think I want to say for lack of a better word, we can be considered one of the smartest people, if not the smartest people in the world. We have these things inside of us. We have these resources. We can solve our problems by ourselves. We can tell our stories by ourselves. We do not need other people to tell their stories or impose their ideas on us. But then my question would now be that how do we then get these African ideas out? How do we get people selling the story or preaching the gospel of Afrocentrism?
I think the key thing about Afrocentrism is that people must be aware
Yeah.
that the way they think now is a result of the colonial education which was put in place,
Yeah.
which was to make us subjects of Europeans, to be studied and to be controlled and to be exploited. We have to do a curriculum change so that our people begin to look at themselves as agents of their own lived experiences and therefore the problem solvers of their problems. The second thing is that we have to do research to get answers to our African problems for ourselves within our own limitations. We have to forget this idea that we have to borrow ideas from abroad, to come here. The other important thing is that, we have to allow free debate of ideas. Nobody has the monopoly of knowledge, of information. We have to let people talk their ideas out, and debate, and then from there we shall get the best to stay there. And we have to stop traumatizing each other with these multiple conflicts, because they will only create poverty, suffering, misery, and running away of our people. It is very, very, very important to also know that the future of Africa lies in the young generation. We have to prepare them for this future in an Afrocentric way.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we shall be producing children for export.
Yeah.
It is very sad to see how many Africans leave this continent to go and benefit others elsewhere when they have been educated very expensively with small resources that we have on the continent.
Yeah. So
you just have to go to any airports, including here in Uganda, and you see masses of them being exploited and taken into slave labor, as far as I'm concerned, using modern techniques to work elsewhere, when there's a lot of what we could use, the very same services, the very same knowledge on this continent to better ourselves.
So basically, our brain drain is their brain gain.
Exactly. And that's a very sad situation. They keep preaching to us that Africa is an unlivable continent. It's a difficult continent. But we are so endowed with so many riches, so many minerals, oil everywhere, fantastic forests, fantastic things, lakes, rivers. And we are told that we are an unlivable continent. And somebody goes to work in the desert somewhere, as the most livable place.
Yeah.
So these are very sad things. To live in snow, half the year, when you could be on your continent enjoying the sunshine and the free fruits.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor. I know you said this in bits and pieces in all of your answers. So my final question would be, Prof, what can decolonialism do? Can decolonialism actually help Africa? Because it's deeper than we think. Can decolonialism help Africa emancipate itself from colonial legacies? If yes, how?
Yes. Two things. One, until the African believes in himself or herself to be able to change, it will be very difficult. So we have to have an educational system which looks at Africa as the central agent to be able to create change in Africa. Second thing, we have to change Africa for Africans, to be lived in by Africans. Otherwise, we are doomed to lose the continent. So we have no choice, about that. We have to decolonize and change our mindset such that we begin to look at our continent as actually ours, and that we can make changes here, and we can be equal to anyone else, in the world. Yeah, other countries have done it. We can do it, and it's within our power to do that. Yes. To me, it is very sad when I see Africans killing Africans. It is very sad when I see Africans suppressing Africans. I think we should be able to emancipate ourselves, sit on the table, have solutions. The Berlin Conference of 1884 divided us. I think we need an African conference to unite us, so that we can be able to roam our continent, cooperate with each other, for the betterment of our continent. These artificial borders are meaningless. They only create conflicts for us. And the guns must be stopped from ruling the day in Africa. That's
So
my
much,
thinking.
Prof. I really, really like the fact that you mentioned the fact that this artificial borders are meaningless, which is why I'm really, really grateful for the government of Rwanda and I think Kenya um, bridging down this gap and saying that we now have Africans can now visit Rwanda, for example, and Kenya without applying for a visa. I think this would go a long way in bridging this gap, this division that colonialism has brought. It would really, really help in uniting Africa. And thank you so much for mentioning the conference. I hope that there will be at least a few stakeholders who can listen to this and say, truly, yes, this is indeed something to consider. We need an African conference, which would in turn unite and bridge or basically destroy the gap that the Berlin conference and brought to us as a continent. My take home would be that we have to solve our problems by ourselves, ridding ourselves of all form of gun politics, because we cannot develop ourselves like this. We can't advance Africa like this. And Africa indeed is a livable country. Africa is a country with all the necessary materials that we have to tell our stories and
Yeah, to advance ourselves.
to advance ourselves. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for being here. I hope that our listeners have gotten as much as I have gotten. For me personally, I have gotten so much to think about, so much to meditate about. And I'm really, 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 really looking forward to our next episode. Please, guys, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and follow us on all our social media platforms at Afiana Haki UG. See you next time.